I never expected my grandfather's well would become the center of a fierce homeowner association battle, until Margaret Wilson dumped concrete in it while I was away. But she had no idea I'd been laying a legal scheme for months. What would you do if you discovered your neighbor's grudge wasn't just about property rules, but a decades-old family rivalry? I still remember the day I found out I inherited Grandpa Joe's farmhouse. The lawyer handed me the worn envelope with shaking hands. Your grandfather was very specific about this property. He said he wanted you to have it. Inside was a sketched map of 5 beautiful acres in Willow Creek Estates, including the stone well that had supplied fresh water to the farm for over 100 years. I traced my fingers over the rough paper and felt tears forming. Grandpa had shown me how to draw water from that well when I was just 8 years old. 2 months later, I moved in. The farmhouse needed work, but the land was breathtaking. The well stood proudly in the side yard, its stone circle rising from the ground like something from a legend. I spent my first weekend clearing away weeds and repairing the wooden roof that sheltered it. My next-door neighbors, the Thompsons, stopped by with a basket of muffins. "We're so glad someone's living here again," Sarah Thompson said. "Your grandfather was a great man." "Thanks," I replied, offering them water from the well. First thing I did was test the water still fresh as ever. David Thompson glanced nervously at the street. "Just so you know, the homeowner association has gotten tougher lately. There's a new board member who's fixated with rules." I laughed. "The homeowner association doesn't apply to this property." Grandpa made sure of that when they formed. I have the original documents. The relief on their faces should have been my first sign. 3 days later was watering my vegetable garden when a shadow fell across the soil. I looked up to see a woman in an expensive-looking tracksuit standing at my fence. Her blonde hair was pulled into a tight ponytail, and she wore oversized sunglasses despite the cloudy day. "You must be Joe's grandchild," she said without introducing herself. "I'm Margaret Wilson, Homeowner Association Board Vice President." I stood and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Nice to meet you." "I'm your well is in disgrace," she interrupted, pointing with a manicured finger. "The homeowner association requires uniform landscaping. All water features need authorization." I took a deep breath. Actually, this property was established before the homeowner association. It's exempted from those rules. Margaret's smile stiffened. "No property is exempt from maintaining community guidelines. I've already documented several offenses." She pulled out her phone and snapped several pictures of my yard. "I have the legal documents," I explained firmly. "My grandfather negotiated specific terms when the neighborhood was developed. This well is both historical and my water supply." "We'll see about that." She turned sharply and walked away, her expensive sneakers crunching on the pathway. That evening, a certified letter arrived: 3 violations for unapproved exterior features, non-compliant landscaping, and unsafe structures. Each carried a $100 daily penalty. I called the number listed and reached Thomas Reed, the homeowner association president. "I understand your concern," he said hesitantly, "but Margaret is correct that we have policies. However, if you have documentation of exemption, please bring it to our next gathering." After hanging up, I dug through Grandpa's files in the old oak desk. There it was. The contract from 1982, when developers first created Willow Creek Estates. His property was clearly listed as historically significant, with existing structures grandfathered in permanently. The following evening, a knock at my door revealed Julia Johnson, an elderly woman from down the street. "I saw Margaret at your fence yesterday," she said quietly. "I need to alert you about her. Last year, while Roy and I were visiting our daughter, she had our koi pond filled in. Claimed it was a mosquito risk. 20 years we had those fish." My stomach tightened. How could she do that without approval? "She waits until people are away, then claims emergency action." Julia's hands shook. "We tried to fight it, but the homeowner association backed her. Said we never had proper authorization, even though the pond predated the homeowner association rules." I invited Julia in for tea, and she told me stories about other neighbors. Mr. Finch's garden shed removed, The Parker's play structure dismantled. The Rodriguez family forced to remove their traditional front gate. That night, I couldn't sleep. I went outside with a flashlight and stood by the well, running my hand over the cool stones Grandpa had maintained so carefully. Something about Margaret's intensity unsettled me. I made a decision. The next morning, I called 3 people: a water rights attorney, security company, and the State Historical Society. Your grandfather's well could qualify for recognition, the Historical Society representative explained. These hand-dug wells from the early settlement period are becoming scarce. We'd need to document it. The security company installed cameras, some visible, some hidden. Around my property that afternoon, the attorney, Elaine Morels, reviewed my grandfather's documents. This exemption is valid, she confirmed. But homeowner associations can be relentless. Document everything, every letter, every discussion. I started a detailed log, including photos of my property each day to record its condition. I also printed hard copies of Grandpa's exemption agreement and placed one in my car, one in my bag, and one in a waterproof container by the well itself. Over the next few weeks, Margaret led a parade of inspections past my house. More violation notices arrived. When I presented the exemption documents to the homeowner association meeting, Margaret claimed they needed confirmation from the board's attorney. Then came the letters from neighbors, some supporting Margaret, others secretly urging me to stand firm. The Thompsons brought over dinner one night. She's dividing the neighborhood, Sarah whispered. But many of us are tired of her intimidation. David nodded. The Rodriguezes are resisting her now too. She's trying to make them paint their house a neighborhood-approved color. Had to travel for work the following week. Before leaving, I checked all my cameras, secured the house, and asked the Thompsons to keep an eye out. Something in my gut told me problems were coming. I've done everything I can to preserve Grandpa's legacy, I told myself as I drove away. The well has stood for 100 years. It can endure one power-hungry neighbor. I had no idea just how wrong I was, or that Margaret Wilson was about to make a blunder that would give me exactly what I needed to fight back. Water splashed against my windshield as I pulled into my driveway through the pouring rain after a week-long business trip. All I wanted was a hot shower and my own bed. The headlights swept across my front yard, then caught something unusual where the well should have been. Something gray and solid. I scrambled out of the car, rain soaking through my jacket. My flashlight beam revealed a nightmare. My grandfather's stone well was now a rough concrete plug. The carefully maintained wooden roof lay splintered nearby. No, no, no. I dropped to my knees in the mud, running my hands over the harsh surface. The concrete was fully hardened. Someone had completely filled in my well. A motion sensor light clicked on next door. Margaret Wilson stood on her porch in a bathrobe, watching me. Even from a distance, I could see her grin. I stormed toward her house, rage boiling in my chest. What did you do to my well? The board voted, she called back smoothly. That dangerous hole needed to be addressed for community safety. You should have complied with the notices. You had no right. That well was exempted from homeowner association rules. She disappeared inside, returning with a folder. Emergency action. Provision Section 8.3. When a hazardous condition presents immediate danger, the board may take necessary measures. She handed me a document with signatures. We sent multiple notices. Your continued non-compliance forced our decision. My hands shook. I was only gone for a week, which proved your inability to properly maintain a dangerous structure. A child could have fallen in. She glanced at her watch. It's late. Any further complaints can be addressed at the next board hearing. The door closed in my face. I called the police, standing in the rain as I described what happened. The officer who arrived seemed sympathetic but unhelpful. Sorry, but this is a private matter between you and your homeowner association. You'll need to take it up in court. I spent the night reviewing my security recordings. There it was, Margaret directing a cement truck onto my property the day after I left. The driver looked hesitant, but she showed him documents pointing firmly at the well. 2 workers poured concrete directly into my water source. while Margaret oversaw. Morning brought me to Thomas Reed's home. The homeowner association president seemed genuinely stunned when I showed him the video. I didn't know they were actually going to film it, he muttered. Margaret called an emergency meeting with only 3 board members. She said it was just going to be a safety cover installation. She destroyed my source and a historical landmark. Thomas looked away. The paperwork she showed us mentioned a temporary safety measure, pending your cooperation. Not concrete. Next came a visit to my attorney. Elaine's eyes widened as she watched the footage. This is far beyond homeowner association jurisdiction, she said. Even with an emergency provision, permanently destroying a water supply is unlawful. She pulled out a thick statute book. And there's more. Your deed shows riparian water rights that supersede homeowner association authority, plus the historical registration you filed last month. My mind raced. Historical registration? Yes. The paperwork you submitted to the State Historical Society. It was approved 3 days ago. Congratulations. Your well is now officially a recognized historical landmark. She smiled. Margaret couldn't have picked a worse time to pull this act. The realization dawned on me. My precautions, done out of caution, had created the perfect legal trap. I'd applied for historical status weeks ago, never expecting it would be needed so soon. She's not just liable for property damage, Elaine continued. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical location. We'll file immediately. Later that day, I found 4 neighbors waiting at my door. Julia Johnson spoke first. We saw what happened. We want to assist. The Rodriguez family had photos of Margaret measuring my well the day before the concrete truck came. Mr. Finch had overheard her on the phone scheduling the concrete delivery. Sarah Thompson had questioned the workers and been told they were doing emergency homeowner association work. She's gone too far this time, Julia said firmly. We're tired of being intimidated. I filed the lawsuit, naming both Margaret and the homeowner association the next morning. By afternoon, my phone was ringing. Thomas Reed sounded frantic. Several board members want to talk, he said. Margaret showed us different paperwork than what was submitted. We never authorized concrete. You're willing to confirm that? Yes. This has gotten out of control. I was starting to feel optimistic when a brick crashed through my living room window. Attached was a note. Drop the lawsuit or worse will occur. The police officer who responded seemed more concerned this time. Property destruction and threats are serious matters, he explained, bagging the note for proof. That evening, a local news van parked outside my house. The reporter had received an unknown tip about homeowner association harassment. I hesitated, then decided to talk. I just want my grandfather's well restored. I told the camera it was not only my water source, but a piece of this community's legacy. The segment aired on the 10 o'clock news by morning. My phone was flooded with messages from other residents sharing similar homeowner association horror stories. Margaret's response was swift. Flyers appeared on every door in the neighborhood claiming I was trying to harm property values with my unsightly and dangerous waterhole. Some neighbors began giving me cold stares. Others called to offer support. I was retrieving my mail when Margaret approached, 2 large men flanking her. You've made a serious error, she said quietly. That well was never historically important. Your grandfather knew that. The Historical Society disagrees, I replied, trying to stay calm. Records can be changed. Friends can be influenced. Accidents can occur. She nodded toward my house. I've lived here for 20 years. You've been here, what, 2 months? One of the men stepped forward. The homeowner association has hired us to conduct daily inspections of all properties involved in litigation. We'll need access to your home. I stood my ground. Not without a warrant. Margaret's smile turned cold. Oh, we'll get one. And when we do, who knows what violations we'll discover inside. Enough to condemn this old place, I'd bet. As they walked away, I noticed something that sent a shiver through me. The men weren't wearing any official badges, and one had a tattoo identical to the handwriting on the brick note. I hurried inside and called Elaine. Things are worsening, I explained. I think Margaret just threatened me. Document everything, she advised, and stay somewhere else tonight, I'm filing for an emergency hearing. Tomorrow, as I packed an overnight bag, I looked out at the concrete-filled, well, what had started as a neighborhood dispute had become something far more serious. Margaret wasn't just an entitled homeowner association board member. She was willing to cross boundaries I hadn't imagined. Why was this, well, so important to her? What was she really afraid of me uncovering? The answer would turn out to be buried deeper than I could have expected, and would change everything about my understanding of Willow Creek Estates. My hands shook as I spread my grandfather's old papers across the kitchen table. Tears blurred my vision, but I kept analyzing. The concrete in my well had barely dried, but my plan was already taking form. Margaret picked the wrong person to challenge, I muttered, dialing my phone. Attorney Elaine Parker answered on the third ring. We'd met at a town hall meeting last year when I first worried about homeowner association issues. She'd given me her card and some advice. Document everything. The concrete is still warm, I told, her voice cracking, but I have something Margaret doesn't know. About an hour later, Elaine sat at my table, eyes widening as I showed her my proof. The State Historical Registry certificate I'd obtained 3 months ago after hearing about the Johnsons' Koi Pond incident, the property survey showing the well's protected status, and crystal clear security footage of Margaret directing the concrete truck onto my land. You've been preparing for this, Elaine said, impressed. Most people only react after something occurs. I nodded. My grandfather taught me to think ahead. When Margaret started sending those violation notices, I knew she might try something. Elaine pointed to a paragraph in my deed. She destroyed a historically protected water source. And look here, your deed shows riparian water rights that override homeowner association authority. What does that mean for me? I asked Hope, rising for the first time since discovering the concrete. It means Margaret made a major error, Elaine explained, excitement in her voice. She's not just liable for property damage. This constitutes criminal vandalism of a protected historical location. The fines alone could ruin her. I hadn't expected this level of protection. So what's our next step? We file today, Elaine said, gathering the papers, and we name both Margaret and the homeowner association in the lawsuit. The board members will panic when they realize their personal finances could be at risk. By sunset, the paperwork was submitted. I felt a strange calm as I watered my garden, wondering if I'd need to install a modern well now. The neighborhood felt unusually silent. Word had spread fast. My doorbell rang after dinner. Thomas Reed, the homeowner association president, stood on my porch. Looking uneasy, his usual confident posture was gone. Can we talk? He asked, glancing over his shoulder. Not as homeowner association president, but as a neighbor who's concerned. I invited him in, offering coffee, which he declined. We never authorized concrete in your well, he whispered, leaning forward. Margaret showed us different paperwork, something about temporary covering for inspection purposes. Several board members are willing to testify. She acted without permission. My heart raced. The trap was working better than I'd expected. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Thomas sighed heavily. Because Margaret's done this before. Small things at first, forcing color modifications on mailboxes, making people remove bird fountains, but it's gotten worse. Last year, she had the Rodriguez family's heritage oak cut down while they were at a memorial. That's horrible, I said, genuinely stunned. The board was split on your well issue, Thomas continued. But Margaret claimed she had expert reports saying it was dangerous. Now, we discover those reports don't exist. As Thomas left, promising to bring other board members forward, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you're clever. With your lawsuit, this is just starting. I took a screenshot, adding it to my evidence folder. Through my window, I spotted Margaret across the street talking to my elderly neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, and pointing toward my house. Her face showed no concern, only determination. She doesn't know what's coming, I whispered to myself. The next morning, 3 more homeowner association board members contacted me, separating themselves from Margaret's actions. My case was growing stronger by the hour. Elaine called with news that the judge had scheduled an emergency session given the historical nature of the property damage at dusk. I visited my well one last time before the restoration experts would arrive tomorrow to assess the harm the concrete had set, forming a gray mark on my land. I placed my hand on it, feeling a bond to my grandfather. Despite the destruction, a twig snapped behind me. Margaret stood at the edge of my property, arms crossed. "Enjoying your new addition?" she asked, grinning. "Actually, I'm about to enjoy something else," I replied calmly. "Did you know this well was registered with the state historical office?" Her smirk faltered for just a moment. "That doesn't matter. The homeowner association has control, not over historically protected sites." I said, "You should check your mail. The court documents should have arrived by now." For the first time, uncertainty flashed across Margaret's expression. She recovered quickly, stepping closer. "You're making a big error," she hissed. "I have friends in this town you've never even met. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you just filled in this useless hole yourself." As she stormed off, I realized the fight was far from over. Margaret wouldn't just accept loss. She would escalate. And somehow, deep down, I'd been relying on exactly that. Bright yellow flyers covered every mailbox in Willow Creek Estates by 7 o'clock a.m. My jaw dropped as I read the title. Emergency Homeowner Association Meeting. Resident threatens community values with frivolous lawsuit. Margaret had wasted no time. The flyers painted me as an enemy of neighborhood peace, claiming my unsightly well decreased property values by 15%. Most outrageous was the bold lie at the bottom. Historical status falsified with forged documents. My phone buzzed constantly. Neighbors calling to either support me or oppose me. By noon, the community had split into clear sides. "Don't let this shake you," Elaine advised when I called her. Margaret's desperate. "These flyers actually help our case. They show intentional harm." I wasn't prepared for what happened next. Returning from the grocery store, I found my front yard filled with small signs reading "Comply or Leave" and "Wells Kill Property Values." A group of Margaret's followers, mostly newer residents who'd bought into her vision of a perfectly controlled neighborhood, stood across the street watching for my response. Instead of removing the signs, I captured them, adding to my legal evidence. Then I calmly walked inside, which seemed to disappoint the onlookers, expecting an outburst. "Don't engage with them," Thomas had warned earlier. "That's what Margaret wants, to push you into looking unstable." That evening, a soft knock at my back door surprised me. Mrs. Jenkins, my 78-year-old neighbor, stood there looking worried. "I shouldn't be here," she whispered, "but you need to know what Margaret's planning inside." Mrs. Jenkins explained that Margaret had held a private gathering with her closest supporters. "She's hired someone to check if your historical recognition is backdated," Mrs. Jenkins said. "And she's telling people you threatened her physically." "That's completely false," I gasped. "I know, dear. That's why I'm warning you." Mrs. Jenkins squeezed my hand. "Margaret tried to make me remove my rose bushes last year. Roses my late husband planted. Said they weren't on the approved plant list. I've watched her intimidate people for 3 years now." After Mrs. Jenkins left, I checked on my dog Max in the backyard. My blood ran cold. He was gone, the gate still locked. We searched for hours, calling his name through the neighborhood, while Margaret's group watched from their porches, strangely silent. A text came at midnight from the Johnsons. "Check Margaret's garage. We saw her dragging something there earlier." Heart racing, I called Officer Rivera, who'd taken my earlier complaints. He agreed to meet me at Margaret's property. "I just need to check the shed," I explained when Margaret answered her door in a bathrobe, pretending sleepiness, despite the makeup still perfect on her face. "This is harassment," she protested. As Officer Rivera explained, he had reasonable cause. When the shed door opened, Max rushed out, exhausted, but otherwise okay. Margaret's excuse came quickly. "He was digging in my yard. I was going to call animal control in the morning." Officer Rivera looked doubtful. Through a locked gate, the event shifted neighborhood opinion drastically. Security cameras from the Johnsons' house had caught Margaret tempting Max with treats, then carrying him to her shed. Footage that was now part of my growing case file. The Emergency Homeowner Association Meeting. Margaret had scheduled became her downfall. The community center buzzed with unease as neighbors from both factions filled the seats. Margaret took the podium first, presenting enlarged pictures of my well, calling it dangerous and unsightly. She spoke confidently about homeowner association regulations and property values, occasionally glancing at me with thinly veiled disdain. Furthermore, she continued, "This lawsuit threatens every homeowner here. If one person can ignore our rules soon, we'll have junk cars and chicken coops ruining our prestigious neighborhood." When my turn came, I didn't attack Margaret. Instead, I calmly displayed the historical records, the original property maps showing the well's importance, and photos of similar preserved features in high-value communities. "This isn't about rebellion," I explained. "It's about preserving history while respecting community standards. My grandfather's well has provided water here for a century." Then Thomas asked for the floor. Margaret smiled, clearly expecting his support. Her smile vanished as he displayed side-by-side documents, what she'd shown the board versus what she'd actually instructed the concrete company to do. "The board never approved filling the well with concrete," Thomas announced. "These papers were altered after our signatures were forged." Gasps filled the room. Margaret lunged for the files, but Thomas stepped back. "The homeowner association is cutting ties with Mrs. Wilson and fully supporting the repair of the historical well," he continued. "We've also voted to contribute to the restoration costs, as our insurance won't cover unauthorized actions." Margaret's face flushed deep red. She grabbed her bag and pushed through the crowd. "This isn't over," she hissed as she passed my chair. "You have no idea what's coming next." I stayed late, accepting apologies from neighbors who'd placed signs in my yard. The Johnsons, Mr. Finch, and several others shared their own stories of Margaret's harassment. A pattern emerged of increasing control and retaliation against anyone who opposed. Driving home, my car felt strangely sluggish. I pulled over, calling my mechanic friend, who arrived quickly. His face went pale as he examined underneath. "Someone cut your brake lines," he said quietly. "Recently, too." The fluid is still dripping as police took photos and gathered proof. I gazed toward Margaret's house, where a single light glowed in an upstairs window. Our conflict had crossed a dangerous limit. Would she actually risk my life over a century-old structure? The court hearing was just 2 days away, and I suddenly wondered what other lines Margaret might cross before then. "All rise." The bailiff's voice echoed through the packed chamber as Judge Reynolds entered. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear Elaine whispering reassurances beside me across the room. Margaret sat with her expensive lawyer, her face a mask of arrogance that made my stomach tighten. "I've reviewed the initial claims," Judge Reynolds said, peering over her lenses. "Let me be clear, this is one of the most troubling property disputes I've encountered in 15 years on the bench." Elaine stood and approached the bench with our evidence binder. "Your Honor, what began as a simple homeowner association conflict crossed into criminal activity when Miss Wilson took matters into her own hands." The courtroom gasped as she played the security recording showing Margaret directing workers to pour concrete into my well at 5:30 a.m. The timestamp was unmistakable. "Miss Wilson claims she had proper permission," her attorney argued, "as a homeowner association board member with emergency powers." "That's false," interrupted Thomas Reed, who had been subpoenaed to testify. "I was board president, and no such emergency decision occurred." 3 More board members confirmed Thomas's statement, explaining how Margaret had shown them different documents than what she filed. The forgery expert we'd hired pointed out the altered forms, displaying them side by side on the courtroom screen. Margaret's face grew redder with each witness. When her lawyer whispered something, she shoved him away so hard his water glass spilled. "The well wasn't just any structure," Elaine continued, presenting the historical registry certificate. "It was a protected site, registered 3 months before the incident." Then came the revelation. The police detective investigating my cut brake lines. "We found Miss Wilson's fingerprints on the undercarriage of the plaintiff's vehicle, and security footage from a neighbor shows her approaching the car at 2:13 a.m. 48 hours after receiving notice of this lawsuit, Margaret erupted. "He's been harassing me for months. That well ruins property values. I was protecting our community." Judge Reynolds banged her gavel. "Miss Wilson, compose yourself, or I'll have you removed." During the lunch break, neighbors approached me in the corridor. "We had no idea she altered those papers," Mrs. Johnson whispered. "She did the same thing with our pond. Claimed it was a mosquito breeding site." When court resumed, Margaret's lawyer tried a new defense. "My client may have acted overzealously, but she believed she was serving community interests. The plaintiff has a history of disobedience." "Objection," Elaine shouted. "There is no record of any valid violation." Judge Reynolds sustained the objection, then asked the most unexpected question. "Miss Wilson, did you consult with the water department before filling a registered well with cement?" Margaret stammered. That wasn't necessary for an eyesore. A functioning well isn't just property. It's a water rights matter." The judge explained. "By destroying it, you've interfered with legally established riparian rights. This court finds in favor of the claimant." The judgment was better than I dared expect. Full restoration costs $175,000 in punitive penalties, Margaret's removal from the Home Owner Association Board, and a restraining order requiring her to stay 100 feet from me and my land. As people filtered out, Margaret pushed through the crowd toward me. Two sheriff's deputies moved to block her, but she called over their shoulders. "You think you've won? Your precious grandfather wasn't who you think. Ask about the Henderson land deal in '76. He wasn't so pure." I froze. Henderson? I'd never heard that name connected to my grandfather. On the courthouse steps, reporters thrust microphones toward me. "How does it feel to win against the Home Owner Association?" one asked. "This wasn't about winning," I replied. "It was about standing up to oppression and abuse of control." As cameras flashed, I spotted an elderly man watching from across the street, leaning heavily on a cane. When our eyes met, he nodded slowly before turning away. Something about his face seemed strangely familiar, like a ghost from an old photo. I couldn't quite place. "Henderson property deal." I typed into the county records system, my third cup of coffee growing cold beside me. For 2 weeks after the case, Margaret's parting words had haunted my thoughts. The restoration crew was set to begin removing the cement tomorrow, but I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to uncover. A knock startled me. Through the peephole I saw the elderly man from the courthouse steps. "My name is Frank Henderson," he said, when I cracked open the door. Security chains still in place. "I believe Margaret Wilson mentioned my family to you." My throat tightened. "How did you track me?" "Your grandfather and I were partners 60 years ago," he explained. "When I saw you on the news, the similarity was striking. Against my better judgment, I invited him in." Frank moved slowly, placing a worn leather folder on my kitchen table. "Your grandfather saved my family farm. When drought hit in 1976, he began. Every bank refused us loans, but he privately funded our irrigation project. Margaret's father, who owned the bank, wanted our land for cheap development." "So what was she talking about at the courthouse?" I asked. Frank sighed. "Her family spread rumors that your grandfather cheated us. The opposite was true. When her father's shady banking practices were about to be uncovered, your grandfather agreed not to testify. If they left our family alone." The next morning, as workers began drilling through the concrete in my well, Frank's revelation still buzzed in my mind. My phone rang. Thomas Reed, the former Homeowner Association president. "You need to come quick," he said, voice unsteady. "The workers found something." I rushed outside to find a small gathering around my well. The concrete removal had revealed a waterproof metal box wedged into a side chamber of the well shaft. "It was deliberately concealed," the foreman explained, handing me the container. "Some serious craftsmanship to create that hiding place." Inside were title deeds, bank records, and pictures. My hands trembled as I read the files. Property deeds showing that my grandfather had sold land to Margaret's parents with specific conditions. The natural features could never be removed, historical landmarks must be preserved, and water rights would revert to my family's property if these conditions were broken. "There's more," Thomas said, pointing to bank statements. "These show her father was stealing from his own bank, using rural properties as collateral without owner's knowledge. I called Elaine immediately. "We need to go back to trial," I explained. "The covenants in these deeds mean Margaret's property ownership isn't legal." Word spread fast. By afternoon, journalists camped outside my home. Margaret's attorney issued a statement calling the files convenient forgeries, but the county clerk confirmed their validity, having stamped them herself 49 years earlier. 3 days later, we faced Judge Reynolds again. Margaret looked exhausted and defeated, sitting beside her new lawyer. "Your Honor," Elaine began, "these documents reveal why Miss Wilson targeted my client's well. Specifically, it wasn't merely homeowner association abuse. It was an attempt to destroy evidence of her family's illegal property acquisition." The courtroom murmured as Elaine presented the contracts with their clear covenant terms. "By destroying natural features, including not just my client's well but the Johnson's Pond and 6 other historical sites, the covenants were violated." Margaret's attorney argued desperately my client had no knowledge of these old agreements. She purchased her home in good faith, yet property records show her father gifted her the estate through a family trust. Elaine countered. "She signed documents acknowledging all restrictions." Judge Reynolds reviewed the proof carefully. "The court finds these covenants binding and valid. The deliberate violations invalidate Miss Wilson's ownership rights." Margaret collapsed in tears as the judge continued. "The criminal charges regarding the brake tampering will proceed separately, but this civil matter is settled. Miss Wilson must vacate the property within 30 days. Outside the courthouse, neighbors surrounded me with questions and support. Frank Henderson stood at the edge of the group. "Your grandfather always said, justice might sleep, but it never disappears. He told me he hid those records, knowing someday they'd be needed." The following months brought sweeping changes. Margaret pleaded guilty to criminal damage to avoid jail time for the brake tampering. Her community service sentence included cataloging historical neighborhood features for preservation. The homeowner association voted to disband, replaced by a neighborhood heritage committee that protected unique property elements rather than forcing uniformity. My well became a registered historical site with a small plaque explaining its importance on the day the restored well pumped its first clean water. Neighbors gathered for an impromptu gathering. Thomas handed me an envelope. "We found this taped behind the homeowner association charter." He said, "It's addressed to whoever owns your land." Inside was a letter from my grandfather, dated 40 years earlier. "To whom it may concern, if you're reading this, someone has likely challenged the well's presence. Water brings life, but also reveals secrets when it flows freely. What's buried isn't always forgotten. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right time to return. Protect what matters, not what merely appears acceptable." I run my fingers over those words often, especially when gathering with residents around the well that brought us together. Sometimes the most valuable things we inherit aren't properties or objects, but the courage to stand our ground when something counts, and the wisdom to know which fights are worth pursuing.